Hi, Scott. Welcome to the show. I'm super excited to have you here. How are you?
Good. How are you? Good afternoon as well.
Yes, thank you again. All good on this part, on this side of the of Earth. So getting warmer here, summer, I guess, all over. Also in New York, right?
Yeah, it's been quite muggy, high humidity in New York. I think they were saying we've had probably 14, 15, 90-degree days already.
Hmm.
And all of summer last year, we had 5 days. And then, of course,
Wow.
as you know, living in a very concentrated, dense city, we have that urban effect where it always feels about 5 to 7 degrees hotter. So
Yeah.
definitely summer.
Okay, good, good. So try to enjoy it as much as you can, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, Scott, I mean, you've been in the industry for many years, obviously held some leading position both on the, let's say, the marketing side of the business, the e-commerce platform, digital transformation, storytelling, content. Let's start by probably share, a little bit about your background, and you can start whatever you want that feels relevant for for what we are trying to do here in the industry, in the e-commerce industry, and because our listeners would love to know you better. I know I've been following you for quite a while, and I think there are plenty of things to discuss today.
Yeah, so probably a couple areas to highlight. Obviously, my LinkedIn profile is the best way to get in touch with me. Just Scott Lux on LinkedIn. You can
Hmm.
dive into my background. The three areas I'd like to point out for the audience. One, started my digital technology career with a startup in Seattle, Washington called GoToNet. And what was interesting, we were about 2 years before Google. We had our own search engine called Metacrawler and Dogpile. It was actually born out of the University of Washington. So really interesting, heavy tech background. What was great about that role is we were kind of the precursor pushing boundaries with product development on consumer technologies. And fast forward a bit, I later applied that to my career with Washington Mutual and online banking.
Hmm.
That allowed me to pivot to agency world. And I would say for the audience, agency experience, hands down, from a digital standpoint, was one of the best experiences from a foundation standpoint. I always tell my team if they ever have the opportunity, try to start out and work for an agency. The reason I point that out is one, you work with some amazing talent. And most of the talent on the agency side is really they're passionate about doing good work for their clients. The clients hire us to push the boundaries. So you really have that opportunity to stretch quite a bit, be at the forefront of where you're seeing either creative or technology going. And actually, how do you present that to clients? So I spent 5 years with an agency in Seattle. We got acquired by WPP, which actually moved me to New York in 2008. For those of you who remember, that was the start of the recession.
Yeah.
But the good thing coming out of that, you started to see a lot of brands becoming more commerce enabled. So prior to 2008, you already had your billion-dollar brands, your Nikes of the world, commerce enabled. But for the first time, you started to see 500 million, 200 million, $100 million brands becoming more and more commerce enabled. So I had the opportunity to work with Demandware at the time, where I built out not only technology stack, but led performance marketing, built teams for brands primarily in New York, but focused in the fashion accessible luxury space.
Hmm.
So Diesel, John Barbados, Alice and Olivia, Theory, Intermix, and now over to Esprit, to name a few.
Yeah.
So I like to say I've kind of been on this journey, and I feel like I've seen it all. Probably not all, but let's call it at least 90-95% of the ups and downs and some of the modern challenges facing retailers and brands today.
Yeah. Any specific target that you had to like create this specialization around fashion, or is it just you think a coincidence?
Coincidence. I honestly think it was being in the right place at the right time, because you had a lot of technology being born on the West Coast,
Hmm.
predominantly Bay Area, Silicon Valley, but most of it started to be applied at the time in New York. So you think of financial technology and fashion technology with most of the brands anchored in New York. So part of it was having that background and really pushing that path forward, agency experience, startup experience, technology, but then being in the right place in New York when you start to see a lot of the fashion brands that have already existed for 20, 25 years wanting to become more commerce and tech enabled.
Yeah. So you consider yourself more of a technology person, marketing, maybe both?
Probably both. And the reason I kind of chuckle at that is I was having this conversation with a friend of mine. What's interesting is if you go back 10 years ago, even 15, when e-commerce was first starting,
Yep.
most brands had a classic CTO, CIO, head of technology, but they did not want to deal with e-commerce or marketing tech. It was primarily focused on point of sale, ERP, all the back office supply chain. They're like, hey, you can handle e-commerce, because no one at the time thought it would end up where we are today. It was more of a distraction, a little bit of a pain. So I had to learn a lot of the technologies on my own, and especially on MarTech, as that continued to explode with the birth of social media, the ad platforms. So that's where I would say I straddle both sides. I'm probably a core technologist's worst nightmare, because I know enough to kind of cause trouble, but not enough to go in and actually code and fix any of the challenges.
So it seems that those job description are evolving, right? I mean, CTOs need to be more CMOs, CMOs need to be more CDOs. How do you see the evolution of these, leaderships titles are happening throughout the years?
Yeah, substantial shift. I still believe in a CMO or chief brand officer. And the reason for that, I think you absolutely have to have a strong brand point of view. And I mentioned this at an event I was at last week in New York, the Lead Summit.
Yep.
And this holds for Esprit, but you absolutely have to define as a brand, why do we exist and why do we deserve to exist? And then from there, you have to map out a clear customer experience and content strategy that ladders up to that. So I believe very heavily in CMO or chief brand officer role, kind of having a bit of a resurgence and coming back. Second piece is I think these roles around like growth marketer, growth hacker are going away, because that has to live under marketing for a couple reasons, which we'll probably dive into when we talk about marketing. But you're seeing the customer journey evolve and change, and the marketing funnel is pretty much gone as we know it. People can bounce in and out of discovery. You may not even spend time on discovery, because you may introduce me to a brand and I go check it out, and that's it. I'm off to the races making my first purchase. So I think performance marketing that used to sit under eCom, because a lot of eCom leaders said, oh, I really want to control all the levers in a P&L. I think that's moving away. And the last shift at a C level, I think brands that are successful are also pairing a CMO and a brand officer with a chief revenue officer that is responsible for driving revenue within the channels. So eCom, obviously, retail and wholesale. And then last but not least, technology and data will have a significant play in how do they enable both the brand content storytelling and then the revenue driving channels across wholesale, retail, and eCom.
Yeah. So you mentioned about Spree, and I mean, like the foundation thing. It seems that brands are going like back to the basics, trying to find out their own differentiation and what's the unique story, right? So anything around storytelling, content creation becoming very, very important to differentiate and get the right consumer sentiment. What are your thoughts around storytelling and content creation these days?
Yeah, it's critical. And that's why I go back to, you have to be very, very precise on defining why do we exist and then why do we deserve to exist.
Yeah.
And I posted a comment the other day, I think On Running is doing an amazing job, especially if you've seen the campaign with Federer or Zendaya. So just as content creation, tapping into community and storytelling, authenticity. So all of those elements are critical to how you run today. So 100% agree with you. You have to go back to almost basics. I think we're forgotten. And part of this is why I'm a little bit jaded with Meta and Google, because as a marketer, especially if you back up the last probably 5 years or so, it's pretty much like create a bunch of content assets, motion, imagery, no storytelling, just chop up assets or give us motion. and put them in Meta or Google and let the algorithm determine the best performing. And what we're realizing is that's really expensive. As much as Google and Facebook are telling you which one's performing, they can't tell you causality. And if you try to trace that back to, is that driving a new customer or profitability, you can't answer it. And so that's where I think you have to get back to that storytelling and owning that content creation and story yourself as a brand. Now, that doesn't mean a marketer is the one defining the why and do we deserve to exist, which brings us back to you have to have that brand point of view established and maintained going forward.
So how brands can identify where they are? I mean, in terms of, the data, the analytics part, the consumer sentiment. I mean, what do you do? I mean, do you do surveys? You do like community building? How do you know where you need to improve and what's the current, reality about, what people are thinking about your brand?
Yeah, a lot of it's qualitative and quantitative. One of the best things that I think anyone can do is we're all shoppers. Go out and experience competitive brands, both in digital and physical. And if you have stores, ask the associates. Talk to the store associates. Go in there and observe customers. How are they shopping? How are they buying? I'm lucky to be in New York, where I have a lot of opportunity, different brands, different neighborhoods where those personas or customer are shopping differently, whether it's Soho or Midtown or Madison Avenue. But go in there and observe. What are their buying habits? How are they engaging with the brand? Are they pulling out their phone while they're shopping? Are they talking to people about what they're looking at? So that, to me, is one of the best ways you can observe what they're doing with your own brand and a little bit of the competitive side as well.
Yeah. So do you have a dedicated team who is doing that on an ongoing basis? Do you expect CMOs to do that, like the leadership team to go there and just meet consumers and talk to them?
Well, we all should do it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're working for a brand, you should always get out in the field. I mean, that's one of the things that I would always tell my team for brands I've worked at now and previously. If you're lucky enough to have a store, just do a store visit every couple of weeks. Go in there 2 or 3 hours, go in there on the weekend, just to be closer to the product, to the brand itself and customers. As far as a dedicated team, we don't have that today, but there's a ton of resources. You alluded to doing surveys. You can get third-party data to augment your data architecture and platform. And there's a lot of research. The other piece is go to events. So I spend a lot of time at the Lead. I've done a few other summits over the last couple of months, Shop Talk, NRF. And while they can be painful at times, but it's really good just to have your pulse on what's going on in the industry, but to talk to other brands that are out there, other leaders within the space.
And once you have that clarity, you've been out there, research, you have all that information. How do you process this internally? Because it should be like a teamwork. There are so many departments involved and workflows in place and processes in place. I mean, I believe we are in era of everything is moving so fast, right? You have to be dynamic, go there, experiment, kill campaigns, launch campaigns, innovate versus, profitability. So how do you run this internal, decision making, which needs to be fast, agile, and effective?
Well, there's two different points, maybe three, maybe even four that you brought up, but let's tackle two or three. So one, I think going back to how do you make decisions? One, you always have to start with a hypothesis and how we'll measure it. So before you launch any campaign or do anything, really answer that basic question. What are we trying to achieve and how will we measure it? That could be a customer acquisition campaign. It could be efficiency within supply chain. It could be lowering profitability or increasing profitability, lowering costs. But make sure that's clearly defined and how you measure it so you can adjust. Second piece you touched on is how do you talk about everything going on in the ecosystem? Sure, perfect world, you have a framework or foundation, but a lot of times what I've done is just set up a Slack channel. And it's just like, what's interesting? You can call it, and just people put stories, things they hear, newsletters, and that's a great way just to at least surface and kind of have this running archive, what's out there in the space that we should kind of keep our eye on. And then last but not least, depending on your data infrastructure and architecture, you can easily, if you're running a data warehouse, a lot of the platforms today, whether it's survey data, or if you're working with partners like Hark on customer service, Gorgeous on the platform side, a lot of them have APIs. You can easily ingest that data into a data lakehouse such as Snowflake and structure it and analyze it based on your objectives.
Yeah. And it seems that everything is moving so fast. I mean, every department requires more and more expertise, more and more specialization, right? I mean, there are so many tools out there that you need to implement, like in every aspect of the business. And I see a big trends of this fractional CXO, right, which is all over. Agencies are doing very, very well. So no one knows everything, right? And there is limited time for you already to study new things and explore new things. So how do you keep yourself updated in all the greatest of and latest of greatest of things that are coming over, both on the technology side, on marketing processes, what's working and what's not in marketing? Are you experimenting? Are you researching? Are you creating some kind of processes to keep you up to date with just making sure that decision making is in the right place?
Yeah, and some of it you touched on. I think there's a bit of a reckoning on the tech side because I think that's the challenge is just with eCom growth slowing, you're not going to have a math exercise where it's like, oh, we should see 40% growth year over year, which kind of leads to this false aspiration that we can spend and test on so many different platforms. I think most brands, and caveat is they'll always be outliers, we'll see about a 10% comp in e-commerce. So that puts more pressure on what we were talking about earlier, going back to basics and looking at tech as an enablement, and it really has to be needle moving. So we are probably past the time where I can walk the floor of a conference and have 5 vendors come up to me and run 4 or 5 pilots and then see which tech I want to experiment and move forward with. It really has to be something I'm looking for and moving the needle from a business perspective. And again, sure, there's always outliers, the bigger, 500 million plus brands, but we're not all that size or scale. So then I rely on keeping in touch. I have a very strong peer network that I can reach out to and just say, head of e-commerce or digital at XYZ brand, what are you seeing? Have you heard of this partner? How are you tackling certain aspects? I subscribe to quite a bit of newsletters. So whether it's the marketing brew, technology brew, some of the Digiday content that's out there, 2 p.m. So there's some resources that I subscribe to that really do a good job of aggregating data or content that's on that's out there that I can keep my pulse on.
Yeah.
And last but not least, I rely on my team. I mean, we're all consumers. Again, going back to brands. Whenever I interview people, I always ask them, like, what's something that's really interesting that's caught your attention? And it doesn't have to be technology. It could be an experience they had with a brand. So just really having that curiosity and just always asking questions. What are people seeing out there is a really quick and easy way to stay informed.
Interesting. And it seems there is like a lot of focus on more of the operational excellence. We are in an era of more focus on profitability while maintaining growth, right? So it requires leadership, which is more in the nitty-gritty aspects, and the devil is in the details. Try to figure out everything. And there is a big trend of rising cost of technology, right? So, and so many tools that are being used all over. So what are your how do you handle these first of all facts of rising cost, and what are some of the tips you can provide to to manage this in a better way?
Yeah, I think one, you're absolutely right, comes down to time and time again to execution. You never want the reason that we did not succeed to be because we failed at executing. Because if you execute, we can always have that playbook to go off of. And you need that more and more because you have such precious dollars to spend. And then retail's in the moment, time, and as you alluded to, things are always changing around us. So you have to have really strong team members and partners that can help you execute. I think that's the best way to tackle rising costs because you're very deliberate in your tech choices, your partner choices. You have to work with really good partners that are along this journey with you, because there will be times it gets messy and complicated, and you don't want the old school vendor brand relationship. So I think that's the other side, is you've got to put trust and have a really good selection process on who you choose to work with, both internally and externally.
And that's true also with your existing providers, like doing an audit. I don't know what's working, what's effective, what used to work and not working anymore. I mean, just looking at whatever you have right now as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where we're looking at simplifying our marketing technology stack.
Yeah.
We probably have 10 different partners supporting MarTech. And reality is we may only need one or two, if that many. Because again, it's a lot of times back when you had 40, 50% comps, or at least on paper, you could say, oh yeah, I need to use Telium, I need a CDH, and I need a attribution model, and I need someone to measure full funnel analysis. And then I need a partner to do retention marketing. And so next thing you know, you have 10 partners, insane costs, and the return on ad spend and your cost of acquisition just doesn't pay out. So you have to look at, and I think that's where data is becoming a great enabler to allow you to have greater insight for brands, take control, see what's working, what their real costs are, going back to causality, looking at truly what did make a difference, and eliminating some of the noise and providers that really aren't adding value.
Yeah. So eliminating some of the noise, probably eliminating some of the tools that you're using, some of the existing processes, but it requires brainstorming and probably thinking about new ways of doing things in a better way, right? Let's say future-proof, right? That's for me kind of an innovation, right? So how much space there is for innovation in the current economy, right? I mean, or just focus on performance. Let's improve on the backend side with our 3PLs or inventory or warehouse providers. Let's save 2% over there. It has a big impact on the bottom line. How do you assess excellence, operational excellence versus innovation? I mean, how much time do you spend between those two?
Well, honestly, I think they should be one and the same. I think that's where it got blurred. That's why I always had a really kind of jaded perspective about omni-channel retail and pushing technology in the store. Because again, it's like, okay, how do we do magic mirrors or kiosks or these things that were perceived innovation, but it was really kind of a buzzword. I think from innovation and operation excellence, you can be innovative in how you achieve a reduction in expense for last mile delivery. It doesn't have to be a technology thing. We looked at it through this innovative lens, like you said, changing the way we do things, the way we think. So I would view them hand in hand, and would almost say innovation is an output of pushing for that excellence. Because if you do look at doing it in a different way, you may find a new innovative way to think about it and approach it. Yeah. And then that kind of solves your innovation dilemma. And it's tricky because I used to always think I've had titles like Chief Digital Officer, and I was like, oh, I have to do something really cool because it's in my title. Yeah. And I've kind of set back. I mean, that's why I love data and analytics, and where we're going with the data platform. There's a lot of innovation you can drive. And again, going back to my thinking that technology and data are behind the scenes, and us as consumers expect that. You want to walk into a store, be able to have a seamless experience. You don't want to have to interact with something that's kind of clunky, or maybe a screen's not working. Yep. You just want it to work.
So data is key, obviously, we all agree. And we also agree that the attribution is harder and harder, right? And it's very difficult to really understand why people then are transacting. And so this is probably a place for better technology, maybe use of AI, right? And definitely requires more tools to help understand what's going on. So how do you view this data processing, right? Aggregating the data, analyze it, enrich it, and taking some smarter decision around that. How do you see this area?
And I think, honestly, it's actually less tools. And it's not as complicated because we actually have the data. So you don't need an attribution model any longer. So the way I think of data in our architecture, oversimplifying it, you have the ingest side. So you can work with partners out there, Fivetran, or I really like Sound Commerce that has a new product called Reactor.
Yep.
And their main focus is how do I ingest data from multiple sources, behavioral. So that could be any behavioral data. We talked about customer service interactions, site behavior, store behavior. So ingesting the data. Second part is all these tools. How do you structure the data so you have a common semantic layer? Once that's structured, then you land it in a data lakehouse such as Snowflake, and you can build models on top of that. So whether it's a very straightforward, you could go into an LLM model, you could just have your data science team build a predictive model, you can use out-of-the-box models. But once you have that foundation, it's very easy to create the modeling. The next piece, I love Sigma, which is a data visualization tool. Feels like Excel, looks like Excel. So anybody that grew up in the planning side, demand planning, forecasting, they're used to how it works. But because it sits on live data, you don't have to worry about pivot and VLOOKUP and it crashing your machine. So really great tool and visualization. And then the last piece is using a reverse ETL partner like a Census or High Touch, where once you have your models, they can push them back to marketing platforms, your commerce teams, whatever channel. And so from there, you have a pretty robust stack that'll allow you to support future growth with AI. It allows you to answer that question on the behavioral side, what's working, what's not. How do we create a loose attribution framework? And really the foundation, how do we drive a world-class customer experience and then profitability?
Exactly. So that was my next question about the customer experience side of thing, UI, UX. I mean, are you just analyzing the data and take decision accordingly? How does this fits with probably a consumer journey you have in mind you want to maintain, right? So how do you balance these two?
Yeah, I mean, everything has to be data informed. And going back to the early part of our conversation, once you have your brand definitions defined, it really does come to customer experience, which is across digital, physical, and that human interaction. We can't forget about that side of it, both internally, associates, however you kind of put that out in the world. So within that, you have to do journey mapping and really map out journey. If you're really clear on your key brand focus, your audience, map out those journeys, measure the data on each of the touch points, and then adjust from there.
Yeah.
So that's how CX and user experience kind of flow into it. But again, it's leveraging that customer journey has to be there, tying to CX, ties into your content strategy, your measurability on each of those touch points in the journey, and then optimizing along the way.
Yeah. So obviously, I assume you are launching new campaigns based on the data that you're aggregating, obviously a continuous basis. How often do you change, the look and feel, some of the experience on the website, or, based on this data?
Well, it's a combination, right? So some of your marketing plans or your initiatives are kind of set in stone. Because if you really take a step back with your budget for the year, which budget is usually defined as the revenue you need to achieve, that's anchored in a sales plan by channel, retail, wholesale, eCom. You can eliminate one if you're direct to consumer, you don't sell in those channels. But then that's further anchored by your product assortment and your buying and merchandising strategy. So once all of that is defined, that feeds into a holistic marketing campaign. And you have those marketing moments mapped out, the channels they'll run in, and the execution. You have to always, again, be measuring those, hindsighting performance, and that's where you can adjust and optimize. The other piece that we're always looking at is, as we know, retail's in the moment, said that earlier, things don't always go as planned. You have to have a backup plan B. So we're constantly looking at that data. Now it's much easier. Again, back to the architecture we talked about, if we say we want to chase this opportunity because we're seeing new customers are leaning towards this product or category more than we expected, then great, let's spin up an audience, get some creative and push, through that ETL layer, a new campaign into whatever channel resonates the most with them.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, supply chain, you need to align with all these new initiatives that obviously marketing is want to launch every day, something new, but there is a reality of inventories and these
Well,
cycles are a
that's
little bit
why,
different, right? Yeah.
yeah, 100%. That's why you have your marketing calendar set, and there is flexibility with
Yeah.
that. But you can't, we're not a fast fashion brand. We can talk
Correct.
about, the ones that are out there today, but I think that's where true brands, you'll have that calendar, you'll have your cadence, and there's flexibility, but you can't just spin up a new product that quickly.
Yeah. So, Scott, when we planned for this episode, you said something that resonates a lot, and I would love to have your feedback on that. You said that brands can't afford what they used to spend, right? So, what do you mean by that?
Well, a lot of brands, if you go back to pre-COVID days, and I think some of the challenges with all the private equity VC money that was flowing into direct-to-consumer brands at the time, most of them were operating, call it 5 or 10% revenue contribution from eCom.
Yeah.
And the basic model was, if we can get that to 50% revenue contribution, we can go from a $200 million to a $400 million brand in a year or two, double, triple our investment. And so let's put a bunch of money in marketing and technology. Here's the math, how we're going to get there on paper. The reality is consumers didn't fully abandon. There was way too much competition. There's a lot of fashion brands out there today. So that's where that 40% on paper, sure, you could go to Salesforce and spend enterprise dollars when you have that type of growth. But when that growth doesn't materialize and you're seeing 10% growth in commerce, which I think will be here to stay for eCom, of course, again, there'll always be an outlier. You have to rethink. You can't always go with Salesforce. You have to look at Shopify, other OMS partners like Pipe 17 that we work with. They're much more nimble, have a stronger foundation, more dynamic, and give you that flexibility, and kind of let go of the Forrester rankings and the big enterprise options that you used to pick. And again, have a little bit of trust in your partner, do some vetting. But I love some of the smaller, lower cost companies because you can also shape their product roadmap too. And that's where you have to focus and get that cost structure down. And last but not least, we touched on it earlier with marketing. Instead of bringing on board 10 or 15 partners, get that down to 5.
Yeah. And in terms of the various marketing channels, what do you see working for, apparel and fashion? I mean, earned versus owned media, right? Is it like more on PPC? Is it more organic? Is it more influencer marketing, TikTok? What do you see out there that's interesting?
Yeah, interesting is one thing. Not too much is really captivating. Influencer marketing, I think, is really where you have to be. I think the question is whether or not it's working. I think all paid marketing really isn't working for brands, which is a number one challenge they're facing. If you're a startup fashion brand, well, one, I would say if you can reconsider, you should. Because just to get that awareness, there's still that thought, I'll spend all this money. It's really, really tough to get a creator on board that's an influencer, especially within fashion. I think beauty is the exception, but it's hard. And I think paid media, the cost just isn't there. The return's not there. So I think you have to focus on influencer. You have to have a strong content strategy to anchor that around. Look at some of the long form content on YouTube is interesting. But really, I'm just not saying you would abandon it, but just the paid media that we used to look at and paid social and, with Google and PMax is a bit of a mess. Try to kind of pull back on that spend and focus on content creation and some of the older channels.
Even for a larger brand like you, right?
Yeah.
It's difficult. Wow. So think about a smaller brand that want to differentiate. It's like almost mission impossible, right?
Yeah. Well, because if you think of the model as it exists today, right? Like Google and Meta have a selfish interest. because they want to protect their ad spend. So put all this money in PMAX, kind of a black box that both are,
Yeah.
and then kind of let the algorithm tell you what works and doesn't work. Then you have this old agency model where they charge you 8 or 10% of media spend on top of that. Then you have your marketing team that's relying on both of those two to tell them what's working, what's not. They can't tell you when a change was made. So it's really hard to understand, okay, what did you change? We saw this spike. No one can really answer it. So it's a bit convoluted. I think you're seeing some really interesting traction within connected TV.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you have to have that content.
Yeah.
So really interesting on that side of it, running campaigns with Hulu and some of the connected
Retail
platforms,
media,
Netflix.
yeah.
And obviously Amazon, you cannot ignore their ad platform and some of the marketplaces, Walmart, Target, to name a few of the others. So I think that ad ecosystem you'll see continuing to expand more so than Meta and Google.
Yeah. So that's on the acquisition side. So what are some of the best practices on the retention side?
Same thing. And I think this also goes to, I think the whole acquisition retention model is broken too, because it's combined. But this is where you really have to step back within your data platform and really look at starting with revenue. How much revenue do we need to drive per month? And understand, okay, based on product we bought, how many new customers do we need to get into the brand per month? How many do we need to retain? And you have to look at that partnering with your agency, marketing team. Can we afford to acquire those new customers? Mm-hmm. Because you may need 10,000 new customers a month, but we don't have budget to acquire them. So then your next step goes into that retention. How do we get more spend out of them? So if I can get you to buy one more time a year, does that meet our revenue targets? And using your data platform to really give you that insight, and then building, this goes back to what you're saying, dynamic campaigns. How do we drive loyalty programs? How do we do certain activities, store events to get you to come in and engage with the brand or buy one more time if we know the cost of media and acquisition cost is too high?
Great, Scott. Super, super interesting. I know you have really a long history of experience and knowledge, and you've done so many things, and you're also in a position where you can pass that knowledge and share it with others. So what are some of the tips you can provide or other e-commerce leaders out there? I mean, probably, looking for more knowledge and experience and practices.
Yeah. So a couple things. We touched on data. And I think really looking at, before you run into getting an AI partner, because everyone now has AI, and especially in the partner ecosystem, but really thinking about your data architecture and data structure. With Snowflake and some of the partners I mentioned, like a Sound Commerce Reactor, High Touch, Sigma, it's not that complex to build out that infrastructure. So be thinking about your data architecture. If you have a data team, really making sure they are part of the conversation and how they enable branding and marketing for you. So that's the first piece. Second piece is to just continue to be curious. We dove on that a little bit, but there's so much happening. So just have that curiosity, network, really become friends with a lot of peers in the industry, because having that knowledge share is critical. And you'll find within digital e-commerce circles, people are willing to share and talk about what partners work, which ones don't.
What about some of the, let's say, management skills, future of work? I mean, Gen Z is coming to become employees. What are some of the things you see from your, let's say, management type of expertise that you see evolving over the years?
Oh man, that's a tricky one. I would say going back to, I can't stress enough just that curiosity. That's one of the biggest interview questions I ask is, again, what captures their attention when they see that's interesting. Doesn't have to be a tech piece. It can be a brand campaign. Second piece is hiring for people versus skills. I would always call it kind of the road test rule.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically, let's say, we're in New York and our flight gets delayed and we have to drive 3 hours. Could you and I spend 3 hours in a car and enjoy that conversation,
Yeah.
get along? Or is it going to be like, okay, I cannot wait to get out of this car? And if you have that side of it, you shouldn't hire them. They could be the most talented person in the world. So that's the other piece. And the last piece, I believe in transparency, both managing up and managing down. And, we won't dive into the whole remote versus not remote. I fully believe my role as a leader is I expect my teams to be smarter in their craft than I am, and that I will give them the capabilities to do the work they were hired for. And my role as a leader is to make sure I get all the blockers out of the way. And I think as they continue to move up in leadership, it's how you show up to your teams that's most critical, and look for that as you become a leader or as you're working for different leaders. Evaluate how are they showing up day to day. And that's a really critical piece on defining what that culture is of the company going forward.
Yeah, there's a difference between leader and a manager, right? I mean, asking the person what do you think we should do versus here is what you should do, right? So that's definitely a completely different mentality. And Scott, I mean, this is a part of the episode where I usually ask my guest about a fun fact about themselves. So I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, passionate runner. So I came about running a little bit late in life, about 10 years ago, but it really has served me well for a couple reasons. It's my one escape. I don't run with my phone, so I can truly disconnect. But I've also met some great people. And with all my roles, I've been able to travel. And I think the best way to see and experience the city is either running or walking through it.
Wow.
So it's something that's passionate, just as I explore different communities and cultures, getting to know people, and then it's a good break to get away from the day-to-day.
Yeah. The way you said, I mean, it seems that it really helps you reduce the clutter, reduce the load, right? And just having this more balanced, way of life. Great. Scott, anything else you want to add?
No, I think we covered it. Thanks for having me. Good conversation on a Monday morning here in New York, Monday afternoon for you over in Tel Aviv. So appreciate the time.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Really super interesting. Thank you so much for your time, and wish you an amazing year. Thank you.
Likewise.